Hi friends, if you're like me, you can't do a high kick. No follow-up. I'm just disappointed. Or you want to talk about composition using framing and a shortcut that I use that makes me think about composition every time that I shoot. That sounds like you. We should talk. So this is actually part 2 of a conversation that we've already started about composition. If you managed to get through the Composition 101 video, then thank you. It was 24 minutes. I know it was kind of a lot. I drew charts and graphs over the images, a little more academic than I think we tend to get. And the fact is, sometimes I am super chill, and sometimes I'm like a volcano of information that erupts out of me and just spews out plumes of magma facts and lava grids, frightening villagers, but also hopefully building foundations from which new things can grow. I've got a great visual. No. Yeah, I'm gonna save this. I'm gonna save this for later. So since we've already talked about the rule of thirds, I wanted to give you a quick shortcut that is going to make you think about these things over and over, and I briefly mentioned it, but I'm gonna touch on it again. You can turn on the grid in your camera, or my favorite shortcut of all, shoot in monochrome. So you can do this on any camera. I'm shooting on the Canon EOS R6. It's similar on the R and the Mark IV. But you just go to quality, you go to your picture style, and you choose M for monochrome. Taking your camera and putting it into monochrome is going to allow you to retain all the information that's there. As long as you're shooting in RAW and you're not doing video, all of the color information is retained. It's going to strip away all of the color and white balance things that you can fix later and really get you to focus on looking at shapes and lines. And the thing we're going to talk about the most today is composing using framing, and I'm going to be using the word framing because I think that it allows you to think of shapes that fit outside of heads and not cut through them, because nobody frames by cutting through heads, and that's really what I'm trying to avoid from doing the critiques. I know it's kind of a thing that people don't necessarily think about. So you really want to think about your horizon lines, but also just think about like natural ways to get your subjects to stand out from the background. And I'm just going to like flip through some images from a wedding that I literally just shot. So these are all in black and white, especially for things like portraits. It helps so much with framing. I basically stay in black and white until I have to break out some kind of light. So if I'm using video light or ambient light, whenever I have to worry about white balance, is really when I'm going to switch back. And then sometimes once I've nailed on my white balance, if I feel like it's not going to be shifting, or if I'm not using flash in an area that has a colorful wall, I'll flip it back into monochrome and keep shooting that way. If you've never done this before and you are in the same house as your camera, just go ahead and pause. I'll take a minute. You can take as much time as you want because I'm a video. I'm not a video, I'm a person. But you can pause me and go get your camera and do it so you don't have to think about it. I definitely recommend you try it. I know that I've talked about culling in black and white and how helpful that can be, but this can change the way that you think about shooting completely. And I am going to walk you through some images and how shooting in black and white changes the way that I'm looking at composing my images as I go. So I really wanted to talk about composing using framing, and framing is a very loose term that can be anything from like a physical structure to lighting, to just shooting against a different color building. I have lots of examples to show so you can see it. So I'm just going to talk about what they are and kind of what I was looking for. Here it seemed like a pretty obvious one. I could have gotten up pretty close, but instead I liked the idea of framing them in this little area of light. So when I was looking for framing here, it was more lighting based than it was a structure, even though technically they are in a structure. I was really looking at how they were in the little light area. So same thing here, I was just looking for framing for my subjects to fill the area, and I tried to position him so they would be perfectly in between where this one tree was missing, because there were trees perfectly lined up, and so I just wanted them to fill in this little area. So I'm definitely going to talk more about isolating subjects using lighting, but this is also kind of using framing in a doorway. So that's something that I was looking at here, but they're also isolated because they are the brightest thing in the image. I no longer walk backwards whenever couples are coming at me for the exits at the end of the wedding night, but for this shot, I got down lower than eye level. You can see face here, face here. I'm squatting so that way I could sort of frame them under all of the little banner ribbon thingies that were being waved. Here's another one where I'm framing using light. Here I'm framing them by making them stand out against the ocean. They are very similar in hue and color to the background here. This is a situation where having your camera in black and white can allow you to see like, so they're a slightly different color, but the contrast isn't as good. So I'm really looking for framing with contrast here. Here I'm framing using the building, isolating them here and trying to make it kind of symmetrical. Here I'm using a doorway as framing, and this is my favorite way to frame people. There are going to be a lot of doorways in here. Here I sort of opened this door and had them step in, backed out, and had somebody hold the door so that it was taking up the same amount of space on both sides. This is as literal as framing gets. I saw a little window, and so I did individual couples portraits. This is just a mirror in the room, but because the light was coming in through that window, I was also isolating them using the lighting in the room. Here's another doorway. Here's a window and another window, another door, window. This one doesn't count as framing. I cannot think of anything more challenging than trying to create a really compositionally interesting image while standing in a field. So we were in a really nice field. We were actually by a lighthouse, but I was like, let's go into the forest. And I framed them up and I made a nice silhouette so they were in between all of these trees. This is what was on the outside. So here I'm just framing them up in the building. This is them walking into their ceremony site, and I just got under the arch so I can get images of them walking in. Here's another doorway, but this one's extra special because it says, you know, that they're gonna go get married. Here's another quite literal framing, another one, but this one's extra nice because they're also being isolated by the light here. Here's another bit of framing, another literal doorway. Waiting for people to arrive at this wedding destination because I was like, oh, I am gonna get framing inside this door and framing with the lighting. And I was just waiting, and the flower girl walked through it, and it was super cute, so I was really excited that I got it. There's something a little bit easy to shooting in cities once you have framing in your mind that becomes a little bit complicated whenever you have to step into nature and figure it out there. But on this hike, this overlook, there was a perfect place for me to put clients where they were easily framed by nature in a very aesthetically pleasing way. Here I'm using framing from her new husband, framing in an elevator. Here's two doorways. So here's framing in between the plants, but I literally had them like step down into this little gutter area. Another area where I'm just putting them against something dark. This image probably wouldn't have been as effective or cool if they were just walking in front of the brick. Here's framing where I'm making sure that their heads are not intersecting with the horizon lines, so I had to get up on the road to be able to take this image. Here I'm just framing them inside the building, framing in between two safety gate. Here I'm framing them in the horizon, and they're also getting framed by standing in their own individual fields. This is an image that I turned upside down in post, but I am just framing them inside of the water. I feel like this breaks the image up into thirds in a very nice way. I also had them step down into the little gutter, but I love it because they contrast so well against this dark door. Here's more framing. We had a beautiful beach that we were shooting on, and I was like, let's go and stand underneath there in the only like dark, not cool, dirty area on this beautiful beach. I really enjoyed the framing and the shapes, how it brings your eye through the composition. So here is framing where I'm making sure that I'm not intersecting them with the horizon line, but I'm also trying to make sure that I'm not shooting them in the darkest areas. So I had a couple areas that I wanted to make sure that I was avoiding putting their heads. So they contrast really well because they are in the brightest part of the image. More framing, making sure I don't intersect them with the horizon line, but I also have really cool shapes happening here. Here I'm framing using lighting and contrast. As they were walking against the gold, her hair was almost completely lost on this. So I really wanted to wait until they got to the section of the forest where it started to get dark, so that way they stood out more. Here's some more framing and sort of a doorway stairwell. I just wanted to make sure that I was breaking this image up into thirds. Here's another one where I just missed it, but this image would not have been as effective if I were losing his head and all the greenery up here. This one doesn't count. But this is framing inside of a little window doorway. This is why I think that shooting in cities is just so much easier than nature. Here's another man-made structure where I'm making sure that I'm framing them. Here's framing using lighting and nature, and I also have a little path. I just got down so that way their heads wouldn't be lost in all of this. Framing using another door. So much like the rule of thirds, using framing for composition is super formulaic in a way that is easily accessible. So you can take these ideas and immediately apply them to what you're shooting. Here's more stuff in nature. I'm shooting on a path. I just made sure that I was shooting really wide so that way I was getting all of this stuff on the outside, because even though this would have been fine, like this, I think dark area that frames them is really what makes this. So this was taken with a 24. Here's more man-made framing, and I'm also using lighting. So because this was all shaded back here, they stand out really well. Here's a doorway, and this is actually a patron. Hi, Autumn. I just shot her last week. These images are not edited yet. I'm sorry. So I hope those examples were helpful. I just wanted to give you an idea of how I use both natural elements and man-made elements and light to frame my subjects and try not to intersect their heads. But now we are going to look at some images where I didn't do such a good job. And we're going to talk about how we can fix them because I fixed them. So let's start with this image. She is getting lost in this area a little bit. It's just not that interesting. So by moving a little bit closer and getting a little bit further down, I was able to isolate them against the blue sky, makes contrast, which helps them stand out, and they make a cool shape against the light, which was totally missing in the last image. Here's an image where they just don't contrast against the background in a way that I think works necessarily. So by moving slightly over to the right, we've got this nice haloing effect around them, and we have these nice leading lines that frame them up. This one isn't bad, it's an arch, but I feel like this area doesn't feel like it belongs because this area is so light. So I just moved a little bit so they both have sort of a nice framing halo happening on the outside. Here's a situation where shooting in black and white can be super helpful because contrast-wise, they do not stand out from the background at all. They are blending into the background so much. So this is another situation where I'm going to get down lower and isolate them against the sky. And now they stand out and they're nice and pretty, and the warm tones contrast against the blue sky in a way that is very nice. I got cool lens flare happening, but I noticed there's this nice little tree that I can put them against, and see how they've got like this nice backlit glow. So whenever there's a nice backlit glow, it doesn't stand out as nicely against a plain white or a light blue sky. So anytime I have the opportunity to put them up against something that's a little bit darker, I'm gonna do it. And there's still like beautiful backlight happening, but there's also this like cool framing of the tree, and I'm literally sitting on the ground while I'm shooting this. So here in black and white, I really wanted this image to work, and they were sort of getting lost. So I just had to reposition myself a little bit, and I feel like this shape is kind of cool and works a little bit better than the previous image. So whenever I was shooting this family, one thing that was a little bit tricky is that we were shooting in nature and he was wearing camo, and it was also on a beach. So we have all of these tones that are super similar and just blending in together, and we also had a sprinkler coming out of her head. I just got a little bit lower, got rid of the sprinkler. I'm also isolating them against this green, which means their colors and the contrast stand out a little bit better than they did on the very similar toned sidewalk. So because I usually shoot in black and white and I'm shooting in live view, I don't always have examples of, oh, this would have been really bad if I hadn't moved them. But because I also take too many pictures, I do have examples like this where I don't necessarily plan on delivering them, but I do have good examples to show you of bad compositions and my subjects don't stand out from the background. This is a good one. It's a very busy area. The tones are very similar all over the place. So what I really needed to do was isolate them against something that would show contrast. So I had them stand up on this rock over here, and now they contrast perfectly against the sky, and I love the shapes here. Here's an example where shooting in the city can be fun, but very hard if you are shooting families or people that are moving. Wasn't a good composition because he was intersecting here. The baby's foot was going over her face. This still wasn't a good composition because the lighting was spotty, and also he's intersecting in a weird way here. We've got the baby perfectly isolated up here. We don't have any heads being intersected with the horizon line. I'm a lot happier with this image than I was with the others. There are some situations where you just have to wait for people to move into good framing. Here, she's getting a little bit lost in all of this, but just a second later, she was nicely framed in this little dark area. So because she's wearing white, she's standing up against something dark, and there's a nice contrast to help them stand out. And one thing that I wanted to touch on as far as framing is you don't always necessarily have to find a perfect frame for them. Sometimes it's just about avoiding things in the background. So here's a situation where she was just walking into this space, but I see a lot of portraits where there are trees growing out of people's heads. Try not to cut people's heads off with horizons, and try not to grow things out of people's heads. I moved them off to the side, and now they don't have anything growing through their heads, which is really nice and probably a lot more comfortable. So they were getting totally lost in this horizon because it was cutting them off by their heads. But I shot them walking towards me a couple of times, realized I needed to be taller, and so I shot them in live view with the camera held over my head and the screen pointing down at me so I could see it. This is a very normal way for me to shoot, so I'm making sure that I'm not cutting off people's heads with the horizon line. Here's another situation where they were just getting lost in the horizon. So even though here they have a nice glow around them, this isn't a great composition because they're still getting lost in the darkness instead of standing out from it. So this is a situation where I would lift my camera up and shoot down at them, so that way I was making sure that I wasn't cropping their heads through the horizon. Their heads were going through the horizon, and just by lifting my camera up a little bit, they were no longer in the horizon, so they stand out because they are standing in some of the lighter areas of the water. Here's an area where I've got trees growing out of people's heads. So when I readjusted, I had a really nice frame for everybody to stand in. Sometimes shooting in black and white isn't necessarily about creating the best framing possible. Sometimes shooting in black and white can be really helpful for making sure that things aren't getting too messy or lost. So this is a ceremony shot where when I was shooting in black and white, I realized that like this became one single shape and this became one single shape. And it didn't look great. So by shifting, I was able to frame them up more in this little white area. I also had to sit down on the ground because they were standing downhill from me. This is how I was able to get them to stand out. This is something that you want to look for all day. Make sure there are not trees growing out of people's heads. Shifting a little bit can make things look so much nicer. And I know that I've talked about this before, but my concept of never stop shooting. As people are walking, I'm just constantly taking pictures. You don't really have to think a lot about composition whenever you're shooting in black and white because you're naturally going to end up not intercepting people's heads and creating better compositions as a result. So here they're walking close to the water. I naturally ended up framing them in this area because they just would have been lost anywhere else. Since shooting in black and white removes color distractions, I immediately noticed that this tree was shaped like a little heart, and I perfectly framed them up on either side. Anytime I get into a forested area, especially in autumn, it is so easy for me to lose my clients in the woods in autumn. Not like literally, like we're not like getting lost in the woods. I don't have search parties after my session. I know where my clients are. But when I'm shooting against forests, especially when there aren't a lot of leaves, they get really easily lost in there. The details, it ends up looking really busy. So shooting in black and white can be especially nice for shooting against areas that are a little bit more bare. And it just breaks down everything that you're looking at into shapes and make sure that you're not getting any like sticks going through people's heads. And when the emphasis is on shapes, you are more likely to step back and see cool stuff. This is another image that if I were shooting in color, I don't know that I necessarily would have paid attention to the shapes here. So I really hope that was helpful. I hope you have already grabbed your camera and put it in monochrome and plan to look for framing in future sessions. I think you're gonna find framing and composing a lot easier if you are shooting in monochrome. It makes all the world of difference. I hope this wasn't another like eruptive volcano amount of information, that it was all palatable, but I did make something for you and I'm very excited about it because I've been in quarantine for too long. And I never got to do this as a kid, so let's make a volcano together. Thank you for watching.